In the northern reaches of Scandinavia, where winter darkness lasts 24 hours and temperatures plunge to 40 degrees below 0 Celsius, the Norse developed survival techniques so effective that their descendants still inhabit these lands 1,300 years later. These weren't primitive people stumbling through a harsh world. They were sophisticated survivors who read landscapes like texts, understood seasonal patterns with scientific precision, and maintained knowledge systems that kept communities alive through conditions that would kill modern humans in hours. The archaeological record reveals something remarkable. At Lanceau Meadows in Newfoundland, Norse settlements from 1000 CE show no evidence of starvation, disease outbreaks, or winter casualties despite being further north than most of medieval Europe. The residents thrived in isolation for decades, suggesting they possessed survival knowledge we've since forgotten. Their turf and stone buildings maintained interior temperatures 15 degrees warmer than outside without any fuel beyond what they could gather locally. They preserved fish through winter using techniques that kept protein edible for 8 months. They navigated trackless ocean using only natural signs, ATS, and they succeeded where modern recreations often fail. But here's what puzzles researchers. The Norse left remarkably few written survival instructions. Their sagas mention heroes and battles, gods and voyages, yet rarely explain the practical knowledge that made such adventures possible. How did they know which lichen was edible and which was poisonous when both looked identical? How did they predict weather changes days in advance without instruments? How did their navigators maintain mental maps across 3,000 miles of open ocean? The knowledge existed, and, quote, the evidence of their success is undeniable. Yet much of the detail has vanished, lost when oral traditions broke down and communities modernized. We know they succeeded. We can see the remains of their farms, their boats, their settlements. We can carbon date their artifacts and confirm they lived in places that challenge modern survival experts. But deeper questions remain. What exactly did they know that we don't? What observations, refined over generations, allowed them to thrive where we would merely survive? The answer lies in reconstructing their knowledge from clues scattered across archaeology, linguistics, climate science, and the few surviving oral traditions, fragments of a comprehensive survival system developed over centuries. Number. The observer's edge. The Norse didn't just live in their environment, they studied it with an intensity we've lost. A Norwegian herder from the 10th century could distinguish between 30 different types of snow, each indicating specific conditions for travel, hunting, or shelter building. They had separate words for snow falling in calm air, snow driven by wind, crusted snow that will support a person's weight, and wet spring snow that signals avalanche. Danger. These weren't poetic descriptions. They were survival categories as precise as any modern classification system. Recent interviews with elderly Sami people, who maintain some Norse-influenced traditions, reveal startling observational skills. They can predict weather 48 hours in advance by watching cloud formations, wind shifts, and animal behavior with 90% accuracy. They navigate in whiteout conditions by reading snowdrift patterns, understanding that wind creates consistent sculptural shapes that serve as compasses. They know the precise week when sea ice becomes safe to cross based on air temperature, water currents, and the behavior of seals. This knowledge isn't instinct. It's learned pattern recognition developed over thousands of hours of observation. But we've found something that raises questions. In Iceland's medieval manuscripts, occasional passages describe sky reading techniques, where Norse sailors predicted storms by watching specific cloud formations near the horizon. Modern meteorologists testing these descriptions find they work. Certain cloud types at specific angles do precede storms by 12 to 18 hours. Yet the sagas don't explain why the Norse knew this or how long it took to develop such knowledge. They simply state it as fact, the way we might mention checking a weather app. assuming the reader already understands the underlying principles. The archaeological evidence suggests this observational knowledge operated at multiple scales. Microscopic analysis of Norse settlements shows they selected building sites based on factors invisible to casual inspection, not optimal drainage, protection from prevailing winds, proximity to south-facing slopes that extend growing seasons by crucial weeks. They understood soil composition well enough to predict which fields would remain productive and which would become waterlogged and useless. They chose harbour sites based on tidal patterns, underwater currents, and seasonal wind shifts. Plant remains from Norse middens tell a more detailed story. They harvested angelica in early June when vitamin C content peaks, switched to cloudberries in August when sugar levels maximize, and collected seaweed in autumn when iodine concentration reaches its annual high. Modern nutritional analysis confirms they were harvesting plants at optimal times for nutrition, yet they had no concept of vitamins or chemical composition. They simply knew, through observation passed down across generations, that certain plants gathered at certain times prevented certain illnesses. The mechanism remained hidden. The effectiveness was proven through survival. Number, the fire that never dies. In the Faroe Islands, families maintained hearth fires continuously for generations, literal centuries of unbroken flame. The last such fire, documented by ethnographers in 1893, had burned for at least 200 years, according to family oral history, possibly longer. This wasn't superstition but practical survival technology. Starting fire in wet, cold conditions using only available materials could take hours. Maintaining an existing fire required far less energy than repeatedly creating new ones. The Norse developed firekeeping into an art that bordered on science. Archaeological excavations at Borg in Norway reveal hearth designs with hidden air channels that maintained combustion for 12 hours or more without adding fuel. The channels created pressure differentials that pulled fresh air into the fire's base while venting smoke efficiently, essentially a medieval rocket mass heater, achieving 70% fuel efficiency compared to 20% for open fires. They understood thermodynamics intuitively, building structures that modern engineering analysis confirms were remarkably sophisticated. But the fire technology extends beyond hearths. Bog iron production, STEEZ, extracting iron from marshy deposits using charcoal fires, required maintaining specific temperature ranges for days at a time. Too cool, and the iron won't separate from ore. Too hot, and the carbon content makes the metal brittle. The Norse achieved this without thermometers by reading flame color, smoke behavior, and sound. A master smith could hear when iron reached forging temperature by the pitch of flames consuming specific fuel types. Modern recreations using period tools produce iron, but the quality rarely matches archaeological Norse samples, suggesting techniques we haven't fully reconstructed. Fire-starting methods reveal similar sophistication. The Norse used fire-starting fungus. Yes, specifically the tinder, polypore mushroom, hervo, prepared through a process that took 3 days. They boiled the mushroom in urine, dried it slowly, pounded it to increase surface area, then boiled it again in ash water before final drying. The result caught sparks from flint and steel more readily than any other natural material, smouldering for hours if needed. But why urine? Modern chemical analysis shows urine's nitrates convert fungal proteins into compounds highly receptive to combustion. The Norse didn't know chemistry. They discovered through experimentation what worked and codified the process without understanding why. Number, reading, water. Like text. Norse navigation across open ocean represents one of history's great intellectual achievements. They sailed from Norway to Iceland to Greenland to North America, using no magnetic compass, no sextant, no charts beyond rough sketches. Yet they returned home with cargo, finding harbours they'd visited years earlier with precision that seems impossible without instruments. The question that haunts researchers: how? Linguistic evidence provides clues. Old Norse had specific terms for ocean conditions we don't distinguish. Markle described the point where coastal influence ended and open ocean began, recognized by water color, wave patterns, and bird distribution. Hafvilla meant ocean bewildered, losing navigational reference points. The existence of a specific word for this condition suggests techniques to avoid or recover from it. Stromlöth identified areas where multiple currents met, creating distinctive water surfaces visible from miles away. These weren't general descriptions, but technical terminology for oceanic navigation. The sunstone controversy illustrates our incomplete understanding. Icelandic sagas mention a solarstein, used for navigation in cloudy conditions. For centuries, scholars dismissed this as myth. How could a stone find the sun through clouds? Then in 2013, researchers testing calcite crystals, AI, which polarize light differently depending on the sun's position, demonstrated that skilled users could locate the sun's direction within 5 degrees accuracy even under complete prose. Overcast. Archaeological excavations have found calcite crystals aboard Norse ships, lending physical evidence to saga accounts. But the sunstone only provides direction. Position requires different methods. The Norse measured latitude by star positions, particularly Polaris, and potentially by observing the sun's highest point at midday, techniques documented in later medieval texts. Longitude remained impossible to measure accurately until the 18th century development of precise chronometers. Yet, Norse ships reached specific destinations across featureless ocean. They must have used other methods, possibly measuring sailing time, reading current changes, watching for specific bird species that appear only within certain distances from land, or detecting the smell of land carried on winds from 100 miles away. Modern experiments confirm all these methods work to varying degrees, but which combination the Norse used and how they integrated the information remains partially mysterious. Number. The cold science surviving Arctic winters required thermal management that bordered on engineering. Norse winter houses used triple wall construction, ED, an inner wall of wood, a middle layer of turf providing insulation, and an outer stone shell protecting from wind and moisture. The turf, often 2 feet thick, had R-value insulation equivalent to modern fiberglass while remaining completely fire-resistant. Interior temperatures reached 15 degrees Celsius, while outside temperatures dropped to -30, a 45-degree difference maintained by body heat and a single small fire. But the sophistication extended beyond walls. Norse houses incorporated thermal mass strategically. Large stones placed near the hearth absorbed heat during day, radiating it back at night when fires burned lower. Sleeping platforms positioned above ground level exploited warm air's tendency to rise, creating zones 10 degrees warmer than floor level. They understood air circulation intuitively. Vents positioned high on walls pulled smoke upward while slots near floors drew fresh air inward, creating circulation that prevented carbon monoxide buildup without losing significant heat. Clothing technology matched architectural sophistication. The Norse developed layering systems using wool's unique properties. It insulates even when wet, wicks moisture away from skin, and provides warmth proportional to thickness. A fully dressed Norse person wore 6 to 8 layers. Linen undergarments against skin, wool inner layers for insulation, felted wool middle layers for wind protection, and outer garments treated with fish oil for water resistance. The system could be adjusted quickly by removing or adding layers, allowing adaptation to varying activity levels and changing conditions. Recent analysis of preserved Norse textiles reveals details previously missed. The wool came from specific sheep breeds, Old Norwegian and Icelandic, producing dual-coat fleece with long outer hairs and fine inner wool. The outer coat shed water, while the inner layer insulated. Modern wool, bred for softness and uniformity, lacks this dual structure and performs worse in wet conditions. The Norse didn't just use wool, they selectively bred sheep, producing optimal survival clothing over centuries, creating livestock genetically distinct from other European breeds. Number, the hunger gap. Strategy between late winter and early spring, a deadly period threatened Norse communities. Preserved food dwindled, hunting became difficult in unstable weather, and new crops lay months away. This hunger gap killed more medieval people than war or disease. The Norse developed strategies to survive it, IFS. Strategies we're only recently understanding through interdisciplinary research, combining archaeology, nutrition, science, and experimental reconstruction. Food preservation began immediately after harvest or hunt. Fish underwent multiple preservation methods depending on intended storage duration. For short-term storage under 3 months, they used light salting combined with cold smoking over specific wood types, elder for mild flavor, juniper for additional preservation through antimicrobial compounds. For long-term storage exceeding 6 months, they created stockfish, cod, or haddock, dried in cold air until moisture content dropped below 14%, making bacterial growth impossible. A properly dried stockfish could last 2 years or longer, required no salt, and retained 80% of its protein content. But preservation alone didn't solve the hunger gap. The Norse supplemented stores with winter foraging using knowledge we've largely lost. Specific lichen species, particularly Iceland moss and reindeer lichen, provided emergency carbohydrates when properly prepared. Raw, they're indigestible and toxic. Soaked for hours in water, changed multiple times, then boiled, they become edible porridge, providing about 200 calories per 100 grams. Rock tripe lichen, collected from exposed cliff faces accessible even in deep snow, served similarly when boiled extensively to remove bitter compounds. Seaweed collection continued through winter in coastal areas. Dulse, gathered from rocks during low tide, provided iodine, iron, and vitamin B12, nutrients critically lacking in winter diets. They consumed it raw, dried, or cooked into porridge, recognizing that it prevented certain illnesses without understanding the biochemical mechanisms. Modern nutritional analysis shows traditional Norse winter diets, while monotonous, contained sufficient micronutrients to prevent deficiency diseases common elsewhere in medieval Europe. The timing of food stores reveals sophisticated planning. Archaeological analysis of storage pits shows seasonal variation in contents. Summer stores emphasized fresh foods consumed quickly. Autumn stores focused on long-keeping items. Winter stores contained increasingly processed, calorically dense foods. They weren't just preserving randomly, they sequenced consumption to maximize nutrition and minimize waste, eating perishables first and extending durable stores across the longest possible period. Number, what we've lost in 1952, a Norwegian anthropologist documented the last person in Telemark who could start fire using only a bow drill and natural materials. She was 83 years old. She demonstrated the technique once for the camera, then died 6 weeks later. The knowledge, maintained in unbroken tradition since the Stone Age, ended with her. Similar losses occurred across Scandinavia throughout the 20th century, as traditional skills became unnecessary in modern contexts. We possess archaeological evidence of Norse capabilities. Their buildings, their tools, their settlements prove they succeeded. We have fragmentary written records describing some techniques. We've conducted experimental reconstructions, attempting to replicate their methods, yet gaps remain. Why did certain settlements thrive while others failed despite seemingly identical conditions? How did they maintain mental catalogues of hundreds of plants, animals, and materials with their properties and uses? What selection pressures over generations shaped their choices of what knowledge to preserve versus discard? The Norse developed their survival systems over at least 3,000 years, from Bronze Age settlements through the Viking Age. Each generation tested methods, retained what worked, and discarded what failed, an evolutionary process, refining knowledge with survival as the ultimate selection pressure. They solved problems we're only recently recognizing: sustainable resource management, renewable energy through wind and water power, food security in harsh climates, and long-distance navigation without fossil fuels. But deeper questions remain. Modern attempts to recreate Norse living conditions, even with period-accurate tools and materials, rarely achieve the comfort levels archaeological evidence suggests they maintained. Are we missing crucial techniques? Have we misinterpreted the physical evidence? Or did they possess refined skills, the product of lifetime practice starting in childhood, that cannot be replicated by enthusiastic adults learning from books? The Norse thrived in conditions that challenge modern technology. Their knowledge allowed not merely survival, but communities that supported art, literature, exploration, and trade. That knowledge, refined across countless generations, represents humanity's long conversation with the natural world, a dialogue we've mostly forgotten in our temperature-controlled, GPS-guided modern existence. What remains are fragments, clues, and questions that hint at sophistication we're only beginning to appreciate. The longship pulled from Gokstad in 1880 was 900 years old, when archaeologists unearthed it from the Norwegian clay that preserved every detail of its construction. 23 meters long, 5 meters wide, weighing 20 tons fully loaded, it represented technology so advanced that modern naval architects studying its design find principles not formally documented until the 20th century. The ship could sail in water less than 1 meter deep, cross open ocean in 12-meter swells, reach speeds of 15 knots under sail, and be beached, unloaded, reloaded, and relaunched by its crew of 35 men in under an hour. Building such a vessel required knowledge spanning forestry, metallurgy, textile production, and hydrodynamics. The keel alone, a single oak timber 20 meters long, came from a tree that grew for 200 years before being felled at precisely the right season when sap content minimized subsequent warping. The planks, split rather than sawn from logs, followed the wood grain to maximize strength while minimizing weight. Each plank overlapped the next in clinker construction, fastened with iron rivets and caulked with tarred animal hair, creating a hull that flexed with waves rather than fighting them, a principle modern fiberglass boat builders rediscovered in the 1960s. But the truly revolutionary element was something archaeologists didn't understand until computer modeling in 2004 revealed it. The hull shape created laminar flow along its length, reducing drag by 30% compared to contemporary ship designs. The Norse achieved this without understanding fluid dynamics as mathematics. They refined the shape over centuries through observation and iteration, building ships that simply went faster and handled better, preserving successful designs and abandoning failures. The knowledge existed in the hands of master shipwrights, who learned through decades of apprenticeship, measuring by eye and feel rather than calculation, achieving results that validated when modern engineering finally caught up to analyze them. Number, the forest technology. Every longship began in forests managed specifically for shipbuilding, ASEA, a relationship between humans and trees spanning generations. The Norse didn't simply cut timber, they shaped living forests to produce exactly what they needed. Oak trees grown in dense stands, competing for light, grew tall and straight with minimal branches, perfect for keels and masts. Trees grown in open areas developed curved growth patterns from uneven weight distribution as they reached toward sunlight, ADT. These naturally curved timbers became ribs and stems, requiring no steaming or bending, preventing the structural weaknesses those processes introduce. Archaeological surveys of Norse-era forests in western Norway reveal something remarkable. Artificial groves arranged in specific patterns, with trees of carefully varied ages. A longship required timber from trees aged anywhere from 40 to 200 years, depending on the component. The forests weren't random woodlands, but three-dimensional warehouses, where each tree served a future purpose, planted by ancestors for descendants' use. The oldest trees, designated as keel timber, carried legal protections. Cutting one without authorization brought severe penalties, sometimes death, because destroying a keel tree eliminated the possibility of building a ship for the next 2 centuries until a replacement matured. But selecting and felling timber was merely the beginning. The wood underwent processing that modern analysis reveals was chemically sophisticated. After felling in winter when sap content was lowest, logs spent 6 months partially submerged in freshwater streams. This leaching process removed tannins and sugars that would otherwise feed wood-boring organisms, extending the timber's lifespan by decades. They recognized that wood felled in summer, with high sap content, became riddled with insect damage and rot within years, while winter felled, water-treated timber lasted generations. Modern dendrochronology confirms their observations. Preserved longship timbers show growth rings indicating winter felling with near-perfect consistency across hundreds of sampled vessels. The splitting process reveals equal sophistication. Norse shipwrights split planks from logs using wooden wedges and mallets, following the grain with precision that preserved wood fiber integrity. Modern sawn lumber cuts across grain, severing fibers and creating weakness points. Split timber maintains unbroken fiber length, increasing strength by 40% while using 20% less wood by volume. A 23-meter longship could be built using timber from just 12 large oaks, whereas equivalent sawn construction required nearly twice as many trees. In timber-scarce regions like Iceland and Greenland, this efficiency made shipbuilding possible where it otherwise wouldn't be. Yet, questions remain. How did they select which trees would grow into which components decades before harvest? How did they maintain institutional knowledge of forest management across generations when individual lifetimes spanned only 40 to 50 years? Some researchers suggest oral traditions with specialized terminology we can no longer fully translate. Others propose physical marking systems that haven't survived in archaeological record. The forests themselves have been logged, replanted, and logged again, erasing evidence of Norse management practices. We know the outcome: ships of remarkable quality built from carefully cultivated timber, but the complete system remains partially hidden. Number, iron from stone and swamp. A longship required 3,000 iron rivets plus tools for its construction. In Scandinavia, which lacked easily accessible iron ore deposits found elsewhere in Europe, the Norse extracted iron from bog iron ore, MAI, iron-rich deposits formed in wetlands through bacterial action. This wasn't inferior substitute material, but high-quality iron that, when properly processed, matched or exceeded the best European steel in carbon content and purity. Bog iron collection was precisely timed annual work. The Norse understood that specific wetlands regenerated harvestable iron deposits every 15 to 20 years through ongoing bacterial processes that concentrated dissolved iron from groundwater. They marked productive bogs and returned on regular cycles, harvesting only mature deposits while leaving younger formations to continue growing. Archaeological surveys of medieval bog iron collection sites show evidence of systematic harvesting over centuries, with some sites used continuously for 500 years, suggesting sustainable management that balanced extraction with regeneration rates. The smelting process required expertise that bordered on alchemy. Building a bloomery furnace from clay and stone, the smith layered charcoal and bog iron ore in precise ratios, then maintained specific temperature ranges for 8 to 12 hours. The temperature had to reach 1,200 degrees Celsius to reduce iron oxide to metallic iron, but stay below 1,500 degrees, or the iron would melt into cast iron, too brittle for rivets and tools. Without thermometers, smiths relied on color observation, where the iron reached working temperature when it glowed white like the full moon, and sound. Certain crackles and pops indicated proper chemical reactions. Modern experimental archaeology attempting to replicate Norse iron production struggles to match the quality of surviving artifacts. Archaeological iron samples from longship rivets show remarkably consistent carbon content between 0.2 and 0.5% AD optimal range for ductile workable iron. Experimental recreations produce more variable results with higher slag content and uneven carbon distribution. Something about Norse technique, high Fa, perhaps specific charcoal types, particular ore preparation methods, or subtle temperature control through airflow manipulation, created superior consistency. The knowledge existed, the evidence proves it, but the complete procedure remains incompletely reconstructed. The forging process transformed bloom iron, a spongy mass of metal and slag, into useful rivets through repeated heating and hammering. Each rivet was individually forged, requiring approximately 15 minutes of skilled work. Creating 3,000 rivets for a single ship meant 750 hours of forging labor, over 4 months of full-time work for one smith. This investment explains why longships were valuable enough to be buried with high-status individuals, and why maintaining and repairing existing ships took priority over building new ones. The iron represented not just material but accumulated human labor, specialized knowledge, and community resources, concentrated into fasteners that held civilization together. Number sail technology and wind reading. The sail transformed Scandinavian culture from coastal to oceanic. Before sails, Norse vessels relied on rowing, limiting range to a few hundred kilometers. The sail, adopted around 700 CE from contact with Frisian and Frankish cultures, enabled journeys spanning thousands of kilometers, opening the North Atlantic to exploration and settlement. But adopting sail technology required solving problems that don't appear obvious until attempting oceanic sailing in practice. The sails themselves represented monumental textile production. A standard longship sail measured 11 by 15 meters, 165 square meters of fabric weighing 300 kilograms. Creating this required wool from 200 sheep, 2 years of spinning thread, 6 months of weaving on specialized wide looms, and treating the finished fabric with fish oil and ochre to increase water resistance and visibility. The fabric wasn't simple weaving but complex diamond twill patterns that distributed stress across multiple thread directions, preventing tears from propagating. Modern testing shows these historical weave patterns handle storm loads 30% better than plain weaves of equivalent thread count. But the sail was only the beginning. Managing it required understanding wind patterns and sailing theory that the Norse developed through observation rather than mathematical physics. They recognized that sailing directly downwind was least efficient because the sail blocked its own wind, creating turbulence. Angling across the wind, broad-reaching, allowed higher sustained speeds. They could sail at angles within 60 degrees of the wind direction, remarkable for square-sailed vessels that modern sailors assume can only run downwind. The secret lay in sail shape adjustment and precise trimming, keeping the leading edge tight while allowing the trailing edge to develop a curved shape that functioned like an airfoil, creating lift rather than just drag. The physical evidence reveals sophistication in rigging design. Rather than fixed sails, Norse ships used complex perillo, systems of sheets, braces and tacks allowing three-dimensional sail shape adjustment. The sail could be reefed, partially furled, in strong winds, rotated around the mast axis up to 20 degrees, and have its lower corners independently adjusted to change the angle of attack relative to apparent wind. Archaeological finds of sailing blocks, fairleads, and wear patterns on gunwales show these weren't theoretical capabilities, but actively used techniques requiring crew coordination and skilled sail handling. Weather prediction became crucial for oceanic sailing. Norse sailors developed what we'd now call folk meteorology, pattern recognition, linking observable conditions to subsequent weather. Specific cloud formations, wind shifts, wave patterns, animal behavior, and atmospheric optical effects all provided clues. They recognized that halos around the sun predicted weather changes within 24 hours. We now know this results from ice crystals in high-altitude cirrus clouds preceding weather fronts. They observed that seabirds flying inland indicated approaching storms. Birds detect barometric pressure drops before humans perceive other signs. They noted that unusual wave patterns with swells from multiple directions signaled distant storms even in calm local conditions. But some of their weather knowledge remains mysterious. Icelandic sources mention specific wind names, NFS, not just cardinal directions but terms for particular wind patterns carrying distinct weather characteristics. Norðangarðr wasn't merely north wind but a specific cold, dry airflow from Arctic regions bringing clear skies and stable conditions. Útsuðvestur indicated a warm, moist southwesterly flow preceding storms. Modern meteorology recognizes these as distinct air masses with characteristic properties, but the Norse identified them through observation centuries before atmospheric physics explained their behavior. Number, navigation without instruments. The sun compass, found at Uinartok, Greenland, in 1948 puzzled researchers for decades. Carved from wood with radial lines and a central pin, it appeared navigational but seemed too simple to be useful, until computer modeling in 1994 demonstrated it could determine latitude to within 1 degree if used at specific times of day. With careful shadow measurement, the Norse carried portable astronomical instruments after all, just ones that left minimal archaeological traces because they were carved from wood rather than cast in metal. But latitude measurement alone doesn't explain how Norse ships found specific destinations across featureless ocean. Modern navigation requires both latitude and longitude, free, north-south and east-west position. Longitude remained impossible to measure accurately until the 1700s, when precise chronometers enabled comparison between local solar time and reference time. The Norse had no such technology, yet their ships reached Iceland, Greenland, and North America repeatedly, returning home with cargo and captives. How did they maintain east-west positioning without longitude measurement? Recent analysis suggests they used latitude sailing, traveling north or south to reach the target's latitude, then sailing east or west along that line until reaching land. This technique works if you know your destination's latitude and can maintain constant latitude while sailing east or west. The Norse knew that Iceland lay at approximately 65 degrees north, as-nor. When sailing from Norway at 60 degrees north, they'd sail northwest until the sun's midday height indicated 65 degrees latitude, then turn west and sail until reaching Iceland. The technique requires accurate latitude measurement and ability to maintain constant latitude despite currents, winds, and drift, challenging but possible with skilled navigation. But this can't be the complete story. Latitude sailing works for east-west journeys but becomes problematic for routes involving significant north-south components. The voyage from Iceland to Greenland runs northwest across 800 kilometers of open ocean, neither pure north-south nor pure east-west. How did they maintain course accuracy across such distances? Modern experimental voyages using reconstructed Norse ships and historical navigation methods achieve success rates around 70%. Good, but not matching historical evidence, suggesting near certainty of reaching intended destinations. One possibility involves dead reckoning, calculating position based on speed, time, and direction traveled. Norse ships could measure speed using a floating log thrown overboard and timing how long the ship took to pass it. A known distance divided by measured time yields speed. Direction could be estimated from sun position, supplemented by sunstone in cloudy conditions. Time measurement presented challenges without clocks, but hourglasses existed, and sand-based timing devices are simple enough that Norse use seems plausible even without direct archaeological evidence. Combining these measurements over a voyage's duration yields estimated position, HS, but cumulative errors from imperfect measurements should make this unreliable over multi-day ocean crossings. Yet, they succeeded. Archaeological evidence of Norse settlement in Newfoundland, combined with genetic evidence of Norse Native American contact and documentary evidence from sagas, confirms they reached North America multiple times. Something about their navigation system worked reliably enough to justify investing enormous resources in oceanic voyages. Either they possessed techniques we haven't reconstructed, or they executed known techniques with skill levels we haven't replicated. The distinction matters for understanding human capabilities. Are we missing knowledge or missing practice? Number. The psychology of ocean crossing. Beyond physical sailing skills, successful ocean navigation required psychological qualities that may be hardest to reconstruct. Modern accounts of North Atlantic sailing emphasize the psychological challenge of days without land, sailing through conditions that can change from calm to life-threatening in hours, maintaining course discipline when every instinct screams to turn back or seek shelter. Norse ships carried crews of 30 to 50 people in open or semi-decked vessels. Anyone could see the ocean's vastness and their vessel's fragility relative to it. The sagas provide glimpses of maritime culture that sustained morale during extended voyages. They describe communal singing while rowing, storytelling during long night watches, and ritualized roles for crew members that created social structure. Archaeological evidence supports this. Finds of game pieces, musical instruments, and personal items suggest attempts to maintain normalcy and entertainment during voyages potentially lasting weeks. The psychological skill of maintaining crew cohesion and morale in confined, dangerous, uncomfortable conditions was as crucial as any technical sailing ability. Sleep management on multi-day voyages presented challenges with no clear historical solution. Someone had to maintain watch continuously. Falling asleep on watch could mean missing crucial weather changes or running aground on unseen rocks. But sustained sleep deprivation impairs decision-making and physical coordination. Did they use watch rotation systems? How long were watches? How did they maintain vigilance during tedious hours of unchanging ocean? Military naval history provides answers for later eras, but Norse sources remain frustratingly silent on such operational details, focusing instead on dramatic arrivals and departures rather than the mundane reality of managing a ship across a week of open ocean. The willingness to undertake such voyages at all, to sail beyond sight of land into regions where rescue was impossible and errors were fatal, required cultural frameworks we can only partially reconstruct. The Norse possessed concepts of fate and doom that may have psychologically enabled risk-taking that modern safety culture considers irresponsible. If you believe your death day is predetermined and nothing can change it, sailing into the unknown becomes less intimidating. Whether this worldview made them braver or simply more accepting of mortality remains debatable, but it clearly facilitated exploration that expanded their world and changed history. Number what the ships tell us. Every preserved longship is a textbook written in wood and iron, teaching lessons about technical capability, resource management, and cultural priorities. The ships prove the Norse possessed sophisticated engineering knowledge, even if they conceptualized it differently than modern engineering. They understood hydrodynamics well enough to create efficient hull forms. They understood materials science well enough to select and process optimal timber. They understood structural mechanics well enough to build vessels that flexed without breaking. They understood seamanship well enough to sail those vessels across oceans. But deeper questions remain. How long did it take to develop these capabilities? What failed experiments preceded successful designs? How did knowledge transfer between generations and across regions? The preserved ships represent successful endpoints of long development processes we can only infer. For every preserved ship, hundreds rotted away or burned or broke apart at sea. Taking their lessons with them, the survivors show us what worked, not the complete story of everything that was tried. The ships also reveal cultural values through their construction. The enormous labor investment, T9, thousands of hours for a single vessel, demonstrates that maritime capability was worth extraordinary effort. The artistic decoration on high-status ships shows these were more than transportation. They were expressions of identity and wealth. The standardization of certain design features across wide geographic areas suggests knowledge-sharing networks and perhaps specialized shipbuilding centers producing vessels for regional markets. The ships weren't isolated artifacts, but nodes in complex technological and economic systems. Standing before the Oseberg or Gokstad ships in Oslo's museums, you see culminations of knowledge refined over centuries, physical embodiments of understanding, painstakingly developed through observation, experimentation, and sometimes tragedy. These ships conquered oceans and enabled the Norse expansion that shaped medieval Europe. They represent human capability to solve complex problems through persistent observation and iterative refinement. They also represent knowledge largely lost when shipbuilding modernized and old techniques became obsolete. We can measure and photograph what survives, but the tacit knowledge, how the wood felt under the adze, how the sails sounded in the wind, how the hull moved in the waves, NZ died with the last generation who lived with these vessels as working tools rather than museum artifacts. Iceland sits just below the Arctic Circle, a volcanic island where glaciers cover 11% of the land surface and only 1% supports agriculture. Summer temperatures average 10 degrees Celsius. Winter brings months of darkness and storms that modern meteorologists classify as unsurvivable without technology. Yet in 874 CE, Norse settlers arrived and not only survived but built a civilization that persists 1100 years later. They established farms in a land with no native trees, created permanent settlements where the growing season lasted barely 12 weeks, and maintained a population that peaked at 70,000 people, all without access to the trade networks and resources that sustained mainland Scandinavia. The first settlers, arriving after 4 days of open ocean sailing, found a landscape that seemed designed to kill humans. The soil, formed from volcanic ash and basalt, lacked the organic matter that makes continental soils fertile. Summer frosts could strike any month of the year, destroying crops overnight. Winter storms brought winds exceeding 150 kilometers per hour, strong enough to lift sheep and carry them hundreds of meters. Volcanic eruptions occurred on average every 5 years, some catastrophic enough to disrupt climate across the northern hemisphere. The island offered no easy survival, only survival through knowledge, adaptation, and techniques refined to match an unforgiving environment. Archaeological surveys of early Norse farms reveal settlement patterns that demonstrate sophisticated environmental assessment. The first generation didn't settle randomly, but selected sites with specific characteristics. South-facing slopes, maximizing sun exposure. Proximity to geothermal hot springs, providing heat, access to fresh water that remained unfrozen year-round, and shelter from prevailing winds. Chemical analysis of soil samples from original settlement layers shows they chose areas with the highest natural fertility, minuscule advantages that meant the difference between marginal survival and complete failure. They made these assessments during summer explorations, reading landscapes to predict winter conditions they'd never experienced at these latitudes. Number, the turf architecture. Icelandic turf houses represent architecture evolved to thrive in timber-scarce conditions where stone alone provides insufficient insulation. The Norse adapted mainland building techniques to create structures using the only abundant building material, earth itself. A typical turf farmhouse used 40,000 turf blocks, each cut from living grassland, stacked in walls 1 meter thick. The turf remained alive after cutting, roots binding blocks together as growth continued, creating walls that healed minor damage and improved, with age rather than deteriorating. But cutting and stacking turf was merely the beginning. The buildings incorporated principles that modern sustainable architecture is only recently rediscovering. The thick turf walls provided thermal mass that absorbed heat during day and released it at night, moderating temperature swings. The living roof, turf laid grass side up over birch bark waterproofing, continued photosynthesizing, removing carbon dioxide and producing oxygen while providing insulation with an R value of 35, better than many modern materials. Rain didn't damage these roofs but nourished them, and snow accumulation added additional winter insulation rather than creating structural problems. The interior layout reflected deep understanding of heat management. Rooms arranged in sequence from public to private, also arranged from coldest to warmest. Entrance rooms acted as thermal buffers. Storage rooms utilized cold for preservation. Living spaces occupied the warmest zones. Sleeping platforms built above floor level exploited thermal stratification, positioning people in the warmest air layers. Central hearths provided heat, but also light and cooking capacity. Multifunctional spaces where families gathered, worked, ate, and socialized during the 9-month period when outdoor work was impossible. Recent archaeological excavations using ground-penetrating radar reveal hidden sophistication in foundation design. Beneath visible turf walls lie stone drainage systems that prevented water accumulation, homeopry. Turf walls are durable only if kept relatively dry, and poor drainage leads to collapse within years. The drainage systems used crushed lava rock with high porosity, channeling water away from foundations using gravity gradients calculated by eye. Some systems include what appear to be French drains, i.e., gravel-filled trenches that intercept groundwater before it reaches buildings, a technique supposedly invented in 18th century France but evidently known to medieval Icelanders 600 years earlier. Yet questions remain about construction knowledge transfer. Building a turf house required understanding which turf types were suitable, grass species, root depth, soil composition, and cutting techniques that preserved structural integrity. It required knowledge of wood joinery for internal frames, stone selection for foundations, and careful timing, i.e., construction had to occur during brief summer months when ground was workable. How did settlers from Norway, where timber construction dominated, acquire expertise in turf building within a single generation? Some researchers suggest they learned from Irish monks who had settled Iceland earlier and left before Norse arrival, but evidence for significant pre-Norse settlement remains sparse. The alternative, I think, that they developed turf architecture through rapid experimentation, implies either remarkable luck or systematic testing processes we can only speculate about. Number, growing food in impossible conditions. The growing season at 65 degrees north latitude lasts approximately 90 days, from June to August, with frosts possible any night of the year. The Norse brought barley seeds from Norway, a crop requiring 110 to 120 days to mature. Simple arithmetic suggested farming would fail. Yet archaeological evidence from pollen analysis, cereal grain finds, and isotope studies of human remains confirms they successfully grew barley for the first 3 centuries of settlement. The solution involved multiple adaptations. They selected barley varieties with the shortest possible maturation times probably through trial and error across multiple growing seasons, saving seeds from plants that matured fastest. Modern analysis of preserved barley from archaeological sites shows genetic differences from mainland varieties, suggesting Icelandic farmers created a locally adapted strain through selection pressure. They planted the differences D-flash earlier than seemed safe, April or early May when frost still threatened, gambling that early planting would provide enough growing time before autumn frosts made late planting a guaranteed failure. But the critical factor was microclimate exploitation. The Norse didn't farm open fields as in Norway, but created protected growing environments using every advantage the landscape offered. South-facing slopes received maximum sun exposure, crucial when total solar energy was limiting factor. Stone walls, built ostensibly to mark boundaries, also absorbed solar heat during day and radiated it at night, creating slightly warmer microclimates within enclosures. Proximity to geothermal areas provided additional warmth, power. Some farms built fields within meters of hot springs, utilizing radiant ground heat. Chemical analysis of soil from medieval farm fields shows added volcanic ash from specific eruptions. The ash darkened soil, increasing solar absorption and raising soil temperature by 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, enough to extend growing season by crucial days. The shift away from barley cultivation after about 1100 CE reveals how closely they operated at environmental limits. Climate deterioration during the medieval warm period's end lowered average temperatures just 1 degree Celsius, seemingly insignificant, but sufficient to make barley cultivation marginal. Rather than face repeated crop failures, Icelandic farmers shifted entirely to livestock, recognizing that grass grew reliably even when barley wouldn't mature. This flexibility, willingness to abandon familiar practices when conditions changed, demonstrated adaptive capacity that modern agricultural systems, locked into expectations of consistent conditions, often lack. Number, the sheep economy. When barley farming became unreliable, the Norse economy pivoted completely to sheep, animals that could survive on grass alone, requiring minimal human intervention for months at a time. Modern Iceland maintains 500,000 sheep, roughly 1.3 sheep per person. Medieval Iceland probably maintained similar or higher ratios, meaning the island supported hundreds of thousands of sheep and tensile animals that provided wool, meat, milk, and leather in an integrated system where every product was utilized and nothing wasted. The sheep themselves weren't generic animals, but specifically adapted breeds that the Norse either brought from Norway or developed through selective breeding. Icelandic sheep possess characteristics unusual among domestic sheep. They're dual-coated with long outer guard hairs and soft inner wool. They lamb reliably even in harsh conditions. They exhibit strong flocking behavior, aiding management in unfenced landscapes, and they tolerate diets that would sicken most modern breeds. Genetic analysis shows Icelandic sheep diverged from mainland breeds over 1,000 years ago, representing either fortunate selection of pre-adapted animals or successful breeding programs that created Iceland-specific characteristics. The annual cycle of sheep management demonstrates sophisticated animal husbandry adapted to extreme conditions. Lambing occurred in May, MIE, late enough to avoid worse spring weather but early enough that lambs matured before autumn. The timing was crucial. Too early, and lambs died of exposure. Too late, and they remained too small to survive winter. Farmers managed timing through selective breeding, retaining ewes that lambed at optimal times and culling those that didn't. In June, after shearing, sheep were released to highland pastures, where they spent summer unattended, foraging across vast territories. This free-ranging period allowed lowland fields to grow hay for winter, while sheep exploited highland grass that would otherwise go unused. The autumn retir, sheep roundup, became the year's largest communal activity. Because sheep ranged freely across unfenced highlands, shared by multiple farms, individual ownership needed verification through earmarks, i.e., unique notch patterns cut into ears that identified owner unambiguously. The roundup required coordination across entire valleys as people formed lines kilometers long, sweeping highlands to drive sheep into communal corrals where they were sorted by earmark. Modern retier continue this tradition, and genetic analysis of medieval earmark patterns recorded in historical documents shows some marking systems remained unchanged for centuries, of family traditions passed from generation to generation alongside the land itself. Winter feeding presented the critical challenge. Sheep required approximately 2 kilograms of hay per day for the 6-month period, when outdoor grazing was impossible, 1,200 kilograms per animal per winter. A farm maintaining 100 sheep needed 120 tons of hay, all of which had to be cut, dried, and stored during brief summer months using nothing but hand tools. The hay meadows received intensive management, manuring with sheep dung collected from winter barns, irrigation using diverted streams to extend grass-growing season, and careful timing of cutting to maximize yield and nutritional content. The entire system operated at the edge of feasibility. A harsh winter, a wet summer preventing hay drying, or a storm destroying haystacks could mean livestock starvation and human crisis. The hidden harvest. Hay and sheep alone couldn't sustain the population. Archaeological analysis of midden deposits, tutows, trash heaps, outside farms, reveals the Norse supplemented agricultural production with extensive wild harvesting, using knowledge of what the landscape offered, and when each resource became available. The supplementary harvest operated on precise seasonal schedules, with families moving across landscapes following waves of availability. Seabirds provided critical resources from April through August. Colonies of puffins, guillemots, and gulls numbering millions of individuals nested on coastal cliffs. The Norse harvested eggs in May and June and Hopeswire, climbers descending sheer cliffs on ropes woven from horsehair to reach nests on tiny ledges. A skilled egg collector could gather hundreds in a day, and eggs preserved in fermented whey remained edible for months. In July and August, they harvested chicks just before fledging, birds at maximum size but not yet able to fly. A single cliff colony could yield tens of thousands of chicks, providing meat preserved through salting or fermentation. Modern analysis of isotope ratios in medieval Icelandic skeletal remains shows seabird protein comprised 15 to 20% of diet, a significant supplement to domestic production. Seaweed collection occurred year-round, but peaked in spring when many species maximized nutrient content. Dulse provided iodine and iron. Kelp offered carbohydrates when fermented. Sea lettuce could be eaten fresh or dried. The Norse recognized that different seaweeds required different processing. Some were edible, raw, others toxic until boiled repeatedly, still others useful only as animal fodder or fertilizer. This knowledge was specific and complex. In modern Icelandic tradition, over 20 seaweed varieties have distinct names and recognized uses. The knowledge wasn't written down but transmitted through direct teaching, with children accompanying adults to harvest sites and learning identification and processing techniques through hands-on practice. Freshwater fish, Arctic, primarily Arctic char and salmon, provided protein through summer. The Norse built stone fish traps in rivers and lakes, structures that funneled migrating fish into enclosures where they could be netted easily. Archaeological surveys have identified over 300 such traps, some still partially functional after 900 years. The timing of fish runs was predictable but precise. Salmon returned to specific rivers during specific weeks in June and July. Missing the run meant losing a year's fish harvest. The trap locations, passed from generation to generation, represented accumulated knowledge of hydrology, fish behavior, and river conditions. Some traps included sophisticated elements, adjustable gates to release small fish while retaining large ones, bypass channels, allowing some fish upstream to maintain breeding populations, and overflow systems preventing trap damage during floods. Number, knowledge of ice and snow. Survival required understanding winter conditions with precision we've largely lost. The Norse developed extensive vocabulary for ice and snow types, each term indicating specific conditions and associated risks. They distinguished between new ice, thin enough to be dangerous, singing ice that made specific sounds indicating safe crossing thickness, and black ice, anchor ice forming on river bottoms that suddenly released and surged downstream, deadly to anyone nearby. Snow terminology was equally elaborate. Vone described permanent snowfields that never melted, important landmarks for navigation and indicators of areas unsuitable for settlement. Skafrenningur meant wind-packed snow, hard enough to support weight, safe for travel. Kruthning described loose powder snow that couldn't support weight, exhausting and dangerous for travel. Merle indicated granular spring snow beginning to melt, unstable avalanche conditions. These weren't poetic descriptions but technical terms indicating specific conditions requiring specific responses. Avalanche knowledge proved essential for survival in a mountainous landscape with heavy snowfall. Historical records mention avalanche deaths in Iceland throughout the settlement period, but certain valleys remained safely inhabited for centuries while others were abandoned after disasters. The Norse learned through terrible experience which slopes generated slides and under what conditions. They built farms on valley floors away from avalanche paths or positioned buildings behind rock outcrops that deflected slides. In some cases, they dug diversion channels that redirected avalanches away from structures, primitive but effective engineering, using the landscape's topography to manage forces they couldn't prevent. But the knowledge wasn't perfect. Catastrophic avalanches still destroyed farms periodically, suggesting environmental assessment had limits. Some risks were unpredictable, or occurred at intervals longer than human memory could track reliably. A slope that seemed safe for 3 generations might release a catastrophic slide during unusual conditions, extreme snowfall, rapid temperature changes, or combinations of factors that occurred once per century. The Norse adapted to living with irreducible uncertainty, rebuilding after disasters, accepting losses as inevitable rather than preventable. Number, the mind of the settler. Perhaps the deepest mystery is psychological. How did settlers maintain hope during the first desperate years? The initial generation arrived in late summer, giving them mere weeks to build shelter before winter. They faced their first winter in partially completed houses, eating preserved food brought from Norway, with no crops harvested and minimal knowledge of their new environment. Some settlements failed completely. Archaeological evidence shows farms established, then abandoned within a generation, suggesting some locations proved unsustainable despite appearing viable initially. The successful settlers displayed characteristics we can only infer from outcomes. They must have possessed extreme resilience, willingness to endure hardship without abandoning the attempt. They showed flexibility in adapting Norwegian techniques to Icelandic conditions, rather than rigidly applying familiar methods. They demonstrated observational learning capacity, extracting patterns from limited experience and adjusting behavior accordingly. They maintained social cohesion through conditions that could easily generate conflict over scarce resources. The psychological framework enabling this resilience probably drew from Norse cultural concepts we can only partially reconstruct. The sagas emphasize themes of fate, endurance, and reputation, for believing your lifespan is predetermined makes present suffering more tolerable, and knowing your actions will be remembered motivates perseverance. The communal nature of survival, Norrøven, individual failure, meant community loss. Norrøven created social pressure that reinforced individual determination. The lack of alternatives, returning to Norway, meant admitting failure and potentially having no place in an already settled society, made persistence the only acceptable option. Modern humans attempting to recreate historical lifeways consistently report psychological challenges exceeding physical ones. Cold and hunger are bearable temporarily, but the psychological weight of knowing they continue indefinitely tests mental endurance more than physical. Modern experimental participants have advanced knowledge. The experiment will end. They can endure because they know relief is coming. The Norse settlers had no such certainty. They endured because they had to, because they'd committed to survival, and because their cultural framework provided mental tools for making suffering meaningful rather than merely miserable. Number. What Iceland reveals. Iceland functions as a natural experiment in human adaptability, AGT, a controlled environment where success required specific knowledge and techniques, while removing confounding variables present in more hospitable regions. The settlement succeeded not through luck or abundant resources, but through knowledge applied systematically. They prove humans can establish sustainable societies in marginal environments if they develop appropriate techniques, remain flexible in methods, and maintain knowledge transfer across generations. But Iceland also reveals the fragility of such systems. When climate deteriorated after 1200 CE, even sophisticated adaptation couldn't prevent population decline and farm abandonment. When the Icelandic Commonwealth collapsed in 1262 and Norwegian rule imposed trade restrictions, the economy faltered despite centuries of successful operation. The Norse had created systems finely tuned to specific conditions. Changing those conditions beyond certain thresholds exceeded adaptation capacity. The modern visitor to Iceland sees landscapes dotted with ruins, stone foundations marking farms abandoned 600 years ago. Each ruin represents accumulated knowledge, refined techniques, and human determination that ultimately proved insufficient. The successful farms, those still inhabited, sit on the same sites occupied since settlement, suggesting the first generation's environmental assessment identified the most viable locations, and that knowledge remained valid across centuries. The failed farms tell a different story. The attempts that succeeded for generations before changing conditions or accumulated environmental damage rendered them unsustainable. We can study the ruins, analyze the artifacts, and reconstruct the techniques, but we cannot fully recover the lived experience of maintaining existence at the edge of survival, or understand what psychological resources people drew upon during the darkest winters, or know what it felt like to watch a carefully tended barley field destroyed by unseasonable frost, knowing winter survival depended on that harvest. The physical evidence shows us what they did. The deeper mysteries of how they found the strength to do it, year after year, remain partially hidden, accessible through imagination informed by evidence, but never fully recoverable across the 11 centuries, separating us from those first settlers, watching their ships disappear over the horizon, leaving them alone on an island that seemed determined to kill them. In 1984, a Norwegian sailor named Ragnar Thorseth sailed from Norway to Newfoundland, using only navigation methods available to the Norse. No compass, no GPS, no sextant, no charts beyond rough sketches. He succeeded in reaching North America, but his voyage took 47 days compared to the saga accounts suggesting Norse journeys took 7 to 10 days. Either the sagas exaggerated dramatically, or the Norse possessed navigation knowledge that modern recreations haven't fully captured. The difference between 47 days and 10 days isn't minor variation. It suggests fundamentally different capabilities in reading natural signs and maintaining course accuracy. The problem isn't that we don't know what signs the Norse might have used. We can list possibilities: sun position, star positions, wave patterns, wind direction, bird behavior, water color, temperature changes, cloud formations, and more. The The mystery lies in how they integrated these signs into a coherent navigation system that worked reliably across thousands of kilometers of open ocean. Each individual sign provides limited information subject to interpretation and error. Combining them requires understanding which signs are most reliable under which conditions, how to weight contradictory information, and how to maintain confidence in your assessment when days pass without any confirmation of position. Modern experimental voyages using historical methods achieve success rates around 70%, 18, meaning roughly 30% of attempts miss their intended destination by enough to require searching or assistance. The archaeological and documentary evidence suggests Norse voyagers achieved much higher reliability. They wouldn't have established permanent settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and North America if finding those destinations was probabilistic gamble. The trade routes between Norway and Iceland operated for centuries, with ships sailing both directions annually. This requires navigation reliability closer to woe, 95% or higher. Something about their system made it work better than our recreations suggest it should. Number. The sun's hidden messages. The sun provides the most obvious navigation reference. It rises east, sets west, and at midday indicates south from the northern hemisphere. But extracting useful navigation information from sun position requires subtlety. The Norse developed through observation refined over generations. The sun's path across the sky changes daily throughout the year. In midsummer at 60 degrees north latitude, the sun barely sets, hovering near the horizon in an extended twilight. In midwinter, it rises late, stays low, and sets early. These variations complicate using the sun for direction unless you understand precisely how its path changes with latitude and season. The Norse developed what researchers call latitude sailing, traveling north or south until reaching the target's latitude, then sailing east or west along that line until making landfall. This technique requires accurately measuring latitude, which the sun's midday altitude provides if you know the date and have a measuring instrument. The Unatok disk, IC, the wooden fragment found in Greenland with radiating lines and a central pin, appears to be exactly such an instrument. Modern testing shows that by measuring the shadow length cast by the central pin at solar noon, a user can determine latitude to within 1 degree accuracy. But using a sun compass requires knowing what date it is, not just approximately, but exactly. The sun's midday altitude changes significantly throughout the year, and misidentifying the date by even a week creates latitude errors of several degrees, enough to miss Iceland entirely when sailing from Norway. The Norse had no printed calendars or standardized timekeeping. They maintained time through careful observation of sun position, moon phases, and seasonal changes. Icelandic sources describe complex calendar systems dividing the year into weeks and months, tied to observable astronomical events. They recognized that seasons didn't align perfectly with fixed day counts. They had leap weeks rather than leap days, adding entire weeks to the calendar periodically to maintain synchronization with solar year. This raises uncomfortable questions about early voyages. The first Norse ships reaching Iceland had no previous experience at those latitudes. They couldn't have known in advance what sun altitude corresponded to 65 degrees north. Did they make multiple exploratory voyages, gradually refining their understanding? Did they extrapolate from knowledge at lower latitudes, calculating how sun behavior should change? The sagas describe discovery, voyages as seeming accidents, ships blown off course that accidentally found new lands, but this may be literary convention rather than historical fact. Deliberate exploration makes more sense than accident for explaining the systematic settlement that followed discoveries. Number. When stars become maps at night, the stars provided navigation references immune to weather variations that affected sun visibility. Polaris, 1914, the North Star, sits nearly aligned with Earth's rotation axis, appearing stationary while all other stars rotate around it. Any navigator who could identify Polaris could determine north with precision. But Polaris sits at different altitudes depending on observer latitude, ATA. At the North Pole, it's directly overhead. At the equator, it's on the horizon. Measuring Polaris altitude thus determines latitude just as sun altitude does. The Norse developed extensive astronomical knowledge, encoded in terminology we can only partially translate. Old Norse sources mention specific stars and constellations by names that don't clearly correspond to modern star names. Leiðarstjarna meant way star or guiding star, probably Polaris, but possibly other stars used for navigation. Kálfastjarna referred to stars in the Big Dipper. Constellation, useful for finding Polaris since the Dipper's pointer stars aim directly at it. But other star names remain mysterious. Alfreðul described the sun but had connections to stellar navigation, according to kenning usage in poetry. Dagstjarna meant day star, presumably Venus, but its navigation role isn't specified. Recent research in ethnoastronomy, MSR, how different cultures understand and use celestial objects, MSR, reveals that the Norse probably navigated using horizon stars differently than we assume. Rather than measuring precise altitudes, they may have noted which stars rose or set at which points on the horizon, using the horizon itself as a reference frame. From a consistent latitude, specific stars always rise at the same azimuth angle. If you know that a particular star rises exactly east at your home latitude, seeing it rise south of east tells you you've travelled north, while seeing it rise north of east indicates southward travel. This technique requires neither instruments nor calculation, IMDA, just memorized knowledge of star positions and careful observation. But horizon stars only work on clear nights with visible horizons. The North Atlantic is famous for overcast conditions lasting days. The Norse must have had methods for navigating when stars were invisible. This is where the sunstone becomes crucial, not just for finding the sun under clouds, but potentially for nighttime navigation. Calcite crystals polarize light differently, depending on its source direction. Moonlight, like sunlight, is polarized, and a skilled observer using a sunstone could potentially determine moon position even under clouds. Since moon position, relative to time, provides directional information similar to sun position, this could allow navigation on cloudy nights during moon phases, providing adequate light. Number. The ocean's living compass birds provided navigation information the Norse sources explicitly mention. The Landnámabók, HEA, the Book of Settlements, describes Floki Vilgaðarson using ravens to find Iceland around 868 CE. He released ravens periodically. Those that returned found no land nearby, while those that didn't return indicated land lay in their departure direction. This isn't myth. The technique works. Ravens are visual navigators that fly to the highest point for orientation. Released from a ship, they'll circle upward, spot distant land invisible from sea level, and fly toward it. Following ravens doesn't require understanding how they navigate. It just requires recognizing they're better at it than humans. But raven navigation was a tool for discovery voyages, not routine navigation. Carrying ravens on regular trading voyages would be impractical. They require feeding, care, and gradually becoming familiar with the ship to the point they might not leave when released. The Norse must have used bird behavior more subtly for routine navigation. Different seabird species range different distances from land. F-night rows. Some remain within sight of shore, others travel hundreds of kilometers out to sea. By identifying which species were visible and in what numbers, experienced sailors could estimate their distance from land. Modern analysis of Norse sailing routes suggests they deliberately routed through areas where bird distribution provided navigation checks. The route from Norway to Iceland passes near the Faroe Islands, Faroe, a major seabird colony visible from 40 kilometers away through sheer numbers of birds in the air. Ships could confirm their position and adjust course before continuing to Iceland. The route from Iceland to Greenland passed near seabird colonies at Jan Mayen Island. These weren't accidents of geography but deliberate route planning using biological navigation markers. But bird navigation has limits. Species distribution changes seasonally as birds migrate. A colony bustling with millions of birds in summer might be completely deserted in winter. Did the Norse restrict sailing to summer months when bird navigation was reliable? Or did they learn seasonal patterns in bird distribution, understanding that certain species present in autumn indicated different proximity to land than the same species in spring? The sagas describe sailing throughout the year, suggesting they'd developed navigation methods that worked in all seasons. But the absence of detailed descriptions leaves us inferring techniques from indirect evidence. Number wave patterns and hidden currents. Old Norse sources mention markhold, sea sense or ocean holding, as a crucial navigator skill. The term appears without explanation, suggesting readers understood its meaning from shared cultural knowledge now lost. Modern researchers interpret markhold as ability to read ocean patterns, 12, wave behavior, current indicators, water temperature, and other subtle signs requiring years of experience to recognize. Waves carry information about distant conditions through patterns that trained observers can decode. Ocean swells, whose long-period waves generated by storms, hundreds or thousands of kilometers away, travel vast distances with minimal energy loss. The Norse would have observed that swells arriving from specific directions indicated weather patterns in those areas. More subtly, swells refracting around islands create interference patterns detectable far downwind. A skilled navigator feeling wave patterns through the ship's motion could potentially detect land beyond the horizon through changes in wave behavior caused by that land's presence. Current patterns provided another layer of information. The North Atlantic Current, AD, an extension of the Gulf Stream, AD, flows northeast from North America toward Europe, carrying warm water that moderates Scandinavian climate. The East Greenland Current flows south along Greenland's coast, carrying cold Arctic water. The Irminga Current circles Iceland in a clockwise pattern. These currents affect surface water temperature by several degrees, detectable by hand without instruments. More importantly, they create drift that pushes ships off course unless compensated for. A navigator unaware of currents would systematically arrive east or west of the intended destination. Archaeological evidence suggests the Norse understood current patterns better than written sources indicate. The sailing routes they establish show course corrections that compensate for known current drift. The route from Iceland to Greenland aims southwest rather than directly west, apparently accounting for southern drift from the East Greenland Current. But this knowledge raises questions. How did they measure drift accurately enough to calculate compensation? How long did it take to develop reliable current knowledge through observation? Were there standard drift allowances that all navigators learned? Or did each navigator develop personal knowledge through experience? Polynesian navigators, who faced similar challenges crossing Pacific expanses, Tidar, developed sophisticated current knowledge through techniques we've only recently documented. They learned to detect currents by watching debris floating past their canoes, feeling water temperature changes, observing how quickly known landmarks appeared or disappeared, and even sensing current through tactile feedback from the canoe's motion. Similar techniques were available to Norse navigators, but whether they used them, and to what extent, remains uncertain. Number, the smell of land. Multiple historical sources mention detecting land by smell before visual sighting. APB. Not metaphorical smell, but literal odors carried on wind from dozens or potentially hundreds of kilometers away. Modern sailors confirm this isn't myth. Land does have distinctive smell, detectable at sea. Vegetation, soil, and coastal processes release volatile compounds that prevailing winds carry offshore. The smell is subtle, easily missed without knowing to watch for it, but genuine, but different. Lands smell different, and those differences might provide navigation information. Iceland, with extensive volcanic activity and geothermal areas, probably smelled of sulfur compounds. Greenland, largely ice-covered, would lack vegetation smells but might have characteristic odors from ice and snow processes. Norway's forested coasts would smell of pine and spruce. Could experienced navigators distinguish these smells and use them to confirm they were approaching the correct landfall rather than just any land? The question seems absurd to modern thinking. The Swick, we trust instruments over senses, numbers over intuition. But the Norse had no choice except to trust their senses, refined through constant use and attention. Modern research on human olfactory capability reveals we can distinguish thousands of distinct odors and detect some compounds at concentrations of parts per trillion, AT, sensitivity approaching that of analytical instruments. The capability exists. The question is whether the Norse developed it through practice and cultural transmission of relevant knowledge. Number, the knowledge system. What emerges from examining Norse navigation isn't a collection of isolated techniques, but an integrated system, where multiple information sources cross-checked each other, building confidence through redundancy. On a clear day with visible sun, latitude could be confirmed through sun altitude measurement. At night, stars provided independent confirmation. Bird sightings checked distance to land. Wave patterns indicated whether land lay nearby. Water temperature suggested which current system the ship occupied. Smell provided final confirmation of imminent landfall. No single technique was perfectly reliable. Sun altitude required knowing exact date. Stars required clear skies. Birds were seasonal. Currents shifted with weather, but used together, constantly comparing different information sources and building a probabilistic picture of position, the system achieved reliability greater than any component method alone. This system's thinking, integrating multiple imperfect inputs to generate reliable outputs, represents sophisticated problem-solving, usually attributed to much later eras. The transmission of this knowledge posed challenges we can only partially reconstruct. Navigation skills required years of experience to develop. Pattern recognition at sea isn't learned from books, but built through thousands of hours, observing conditions in different seasons and latitudes. Young men probably went to sea as early teens, spending decades learning from experienced navigators before being trusted to lead their own voyages. The knowledge was oral and practical, learned by doing rather than studying. This made it robust within the culture but vulnerable to disruption if the transmission chain broke through population loss, social upheaval, or technology change. The knowledge could vanish within a generation. Number, what we've forgotten. Modern GPS navigation achieves position accuracy of within 10 meters anywhere on Earth, updated continuously, requiring zero skill from the user. This capability is miraculous, but it comes with costs beyond the obvious energy and infrastructure requirements. We've lost the intimate knowledge of natural patterns that the Norse maintained through necessity. Modern sailors crossing oceans stare at instrument screens rather than observing waves, sky, and birds. When instruments fail, through electronic malfunction, power loss, or damage, modern navigators often find themselves helpless, unable to fall back on natural navigation because they never learned it. The experimental voyages attempting to recreate Norse navigation demonstrate this loss. Participants are intelligent, motivated, and trained in historical methods, yet they consistently underperform compared to what Norse navigators apparently achieved routinely. The difference isn't genetic. Humans haven't evolved different capabilities in to 1,000 years. The difference is developmental. Norse navigators began learning in childhood, accumulated experience over decades, and operated within a culture that valued and transmitted relevant knowledge. Modern recreators are adults learning skills their culture doesn't normally teach, practicing for months or years rather than decades, trying to extract from fragmentary sources what the Norse learned through immersive experience. Some knowledge may be permanently lost. Specific techniques mentioned briefly in sagas but never explained in detail might have been common knowledge then, but remain mysterious now. The personal, intuitive elements of navigation, ISA, the feeling in your gut about which direction to sail, the unconscious integration of subtle environmental cues, or EZO, likely can't be fully transmitted across cultural and temporal barriers, no matter how much we study the evidence. Yet the Norse succeeded. They crossed oceans reliably enough to sustain colonies and trade routes for centuries. They found tiny islands in vast seas, with enough consistency that economic systems depending on such voyages remained viable. They passed knowledge across generations successfully enough that navigation capability persisted throughout the Norse Age. We know they did it. We have some understanding of how they did it. But the complete picture, the full integration of knowledge, skill, and experience that made them master navigators, remains partially hidden, accessible to us only through inference, experiment, and imagination informed by the fragmentary evidence that survives. In a grave at Firecat, Denmark, archaeologists found a wooden box beside a 10th century woman's skeleton. Inside, seeds from henbane, cannabis, and belladonna, three of the most potent psychoactive and medicinal plants known to medieval Europe. Also present were fragments of what appeared to be a balance scale, suggesting careful measurement of doses. This wasn't a random collection, but a medical kit assembled by someone who understood plant pharmacology well enough to know that the difference between medicine and poison was often a matter of milligrams. The grave goods identified her as a vulva, a seer or healer, someone who held medical knowledge in a society where such knowledge meant the difference between survival and death. The Norse possessed no antibiotics, no anesthetics beyond alcohol and plant drugs, no surgical tools beyond what blacksmiths could forge from iron, and no medical texts since most were illiterate. Yet skeletal evidence shows they survived injuries that would kill untreated patients today. Compound fractures that healed with minimal deformity, skull injuries with evidence of survival for years afterward, and amputations where bone shows healing, indicating the patient lived for months or years post-surgery. They performed these medical interventions using knowledge transmitted orally, tested through trial and error, refined across generations through observation of what worked and what killed patients. But here's what troubles researchers. The success rate suggested by archaeological evidence seems improbably high for a society lacking germ theory, antisepsis, or scientific method. Modern experimental surgery without antibiotics typically results in infection rates exceeding 80%. Norse surgical sites show infection evidence in less than 40% of cases. Something about their techniques, wound cleaning, closure methods, or post-operative care, prevented infection more effectively than we'd expect from medieval medicine. What did they know that we don't understand from the fragmentary evidence? Number, plants that heal and kill. The Norse pharmacopoeia drew from hundreds of plant species, each with specific applications learned through observation spanning centuries. Yarrow stopped bleeding when pressed into wounds. AP nice. Modern analysis confirms it contains compounds that promote blood clotting. Willow bark reduced fever and pain. AGC. It contains salicin, the compound aspirin is derived from. Angelica prevented scurvy when eaten. It has high vitamin C content. These weren't lucky guesses, but accumulated knowledge of which plants produced which effects, refined through countless observations and undoubtedly some fatal mistakes. Linguistic evidence reveals the sophistication of Norse plant knowledge. Old Norse had distinct terms for plants in different life stages, young plants when compounds were most concentrated, mature plants when harvesting was easiest, and dying plants when some compounds actually increased as others decreased. They had words distinguishing between root medicines, leaf medicines, flower medicines, and bark medicines from the same plant, Iao, recognizing that different plant parts contain different compounds. This terminology implies systematic observation of how medicinal effects varied with plant, part, and season. The timing of plant harvesting followed rules we're only recently understanding through phytochemical analysis. Many medicinal plants were gathered at specific moon phases, not superstition but empirical observation that plant chemistry varies with lunar cycle. Recent research confirms some plants concentrate alkaloids and other compounds according to circulunar rhythms, though the mechanisms remain unclear. The Norse didn't understand why timing mattered, but they'd observed that it did, and they encoded that knowledge into cultural practices that ensured optimal harvesting. But the most sophisticated aspect was dosing. The plants in the Firkat burial, henbane, cannabis, belladonna, are dose-dependent medicines. Small amounts relieve pain and induce sleep. Larger amounts cause delirium and hallucinations. Excessive amounts kill through respiratory depression or cardiac arrest. Using these plants safely requires understanding dose-response relationships and having methods for consistent dosing. The presence of a balance scale suggests quantitative measurement, but how did healers know what doses to use? Trial and error would have killed many patients before arriving at safe doses. Perhaps they learned from animal observations, extrapolating from effects on livestock. Or perhaps the knowledge came from earlier cultures. N1 medical texts describe similar plants with dose recommendations, and the Norse preserved that knowledge through oral tradition even after literacy declined. Number, surgery without anesthesia. The Icelandic sagas describe battlefield surgery with clinical detail that suggests first-hand observation. Warriors wounded by arrows had the projectiles removed using specialized techniques depending on whether the arrowhead was barbed. Abdominal wounds were probed to determine if intestines were perforated. One saga describes feeding a wounded man onion soup, then smelling the wound to detect onion odor, indicating intestinal damage. Fractures were set using techniques that modern orthopedics recognizes as mechanically sound. Amputations were performed when limbs were too damaged to save. Archaeological evidence confirms these weren't literary exaggerations. Skeletons show healed fractures aligned well enough to restore function. The bones weren't just left to heal randomly, but were deliberately set in proper position. Some skulls showed trepanation, holes deliberately drilled through skull bone, with healing indicating the patient survived the procedure. The medical skill required for successful trepanation is substantial. Too shallow, and you don't relieve the pressure that's killing the patient. Too deep, and you damage brain tissue. Too slow, and the patient dies from trauma and blood loss during the procedure. But the mystery is pain management. Trepanning a conscious patient would be nearly impossible due to movement and agitation. Norse medicine had access to alcohol for disinfection and courage, but alcohol alone provides inadequate anesthesia for major surgery. The plants, found in medical contexts, henbane, cannabis, opium poppy, found in some Norse sites, all have anesthetic properties when used in sufficient doses. Henbane particularly produces a state described in medieval texts as making men sleep so deeply they feel no knife, likely describing anticholinergic delirium, where patients remain conscious but don't process pain or remember the experience. Modern experimental archaeology hasn't successfully recreated Norse anesthesia using period-appropriate plants. The challenge is achieving sufficient anesthetic effect without killing the patient or inducing delirium so severe they become violently combative. Roman texts describe plant anesthetic mixtures, suggesting the knowledge existed in the broader Mediterranean world, but we don't know if or how it reached Scandinavia, or whether the Norse developed independent techniques. The fact that complex surgeries occurred is undeniable. The skeletal evidence proves it. How they managed pain adequately enough to perform those surgeries remains uncertain. Number wound treatment and infection prevention. The saga descriptions of wound treatment emphasize cleaning with specific liquids before closure. Some texts mention wine or vinegar, both acidic liquids that modern microbiology confirms have antimicrobial properties. Others mention urine, which seems bizarre until you understand that fresh urine is sterile and contains urea that breaks down into ammonia, a compound toxic to many bacteria. Still other sources mention boiled water or water from specific springs, potentially recognizing that water quality affected outcomes without understanding germ theory. The wound closure methods show mechanical sophistication. For deep cuts, they use thread, made from animal gut or human hair, to sew edges together, two materials that modern medicine recognizes as effective sutures. The gut sutures had an advantage we only recently appreciated. They're gradually absorbed by the body, eliminating need for removal. For surface closure, they sometimes used ant mandibles, placing large ants on wound edges, letting them bite closed, then cutting off their bodies to leave the mandibles as living staples. This technique persisted in some cultures into the 20th century because it works surprisingly well, but the most intriguing aspect is wound packing. Several sources describe filling deep wounds with honey, moss, or lichens before closure. Modern analysis reveals sophisticated chemistry in these choices. Honey has osmotic effects that draw fluid from bacteria, killing them through dehydration. It also contains glucose oxidase producing hydrogen peroxide, ATC, a powerful antiseptic. Certain moss species, particularly sphagnum moss used extensively by Norse and later medieval armies, contain compounds that inhibit bacterial growth while being highly absorbent. The Norse didn't know about bacteria or antiseptics, but they'd observed that wounds packed with these materials healed better than wounds left open or packed with other substances. Recent research tested Norse wound treatment protocols using modern microbiology to measure infection rates. Wounds treated with honey and sphagnum moss showed bacterial growth, inhibition, comparable to some modern antiseptics. The treatment isn't as effective as antibiotics, but it's far better than doing nothing, and it explains how Norse medicine achieved lower infection rates than random chance would predict. They'd discovered empirically what we only recently understood mechanistically. Number childbirth in a dangerous world. Maternal mortality in pre-modern societies typically ranged from 1 to 2% per birth, meaning women bearing 6 children face 10% or higher cumulative lifetime risk of dying in childbirth. Norse women bore similar numbers of children, yet skeletal evidence from cemeteries suggests maternal mortality rates at the lower end of that range. Something about Norse obstetric practices. Improved outcomes relative to other medieval cultures. The sagas mention midwives as specialized practitioners, suggesting professional knowledge distinct from general healing. These women accumulated experience across hundreds of births, learning to recognize complications and intervene when possible. Archaeological evidence from female graves occasionally includes what appear to be obstetric tools, OPP, smooth stones possibly used for massage, hook-shaped implements that might have assisted in manual extraction of retained placenta, and blades suitable for cutting umbilical cords. But the techniques remain largely mysterious, because Norse sources rarely describe childbirth in detail. Horan 10. It was women's work, and male saga writers showed little interest. The few descriptions that exist mention positioning, having women squat or kneel during labor, rather than lie flat, which modern obstetrics recognizes as mechanically advantageous, using gravity to assist delivery. They mention massage techniques and specific herbal preparations, but without enough detail to reconstruct the complete practices. One intriguing detail appears in several sources: women drinking ergot-contaminated rye during difficult labor. Ergot is a fungal infection of rye that produces alkaloids, including ergotamine, a compound that causes powerful uterine contractions. Modern medicine uses synthetic ergot derivatives to control postpartum hemorrhage. The Norse apparently discovered that contaminated rye accelerated labor and reduced bleeding, though the dose control would have been challenging since ergot concentration varies. Too little achieved nothing. Too much caused convulsions and potentially death. The fact that they used it suggests they'd refined dosing through experience, accepting occasional adverse outcomes in exchange for lives saved when labor stalled dangerously. Number, mental illness, and the mind's disorders. The Norse recognized mental illness as distinct from physical ailments, using terms that suggest sophisticated understanding of different conditions. Other described a state of inspired madness associated with warriors and poets, possibly what we'd now call mania or psychosis. Vitleysa meant witlessness or mental incompetence, perhaps describing dementia or severe intellectual disability. Mothsemi indicated melancholy or deep sadness, recognizably similar to modern depression. Treatment approaches varied by condition. For melancholy, sources mention prolonged stays in heated baths using water from hot springs, possibly the earliest documented hydrotherapy. For violent madness, they sometimes used physical restraint, but several sources also mention plant treatments that calmed agitation. Cannabis, henbane, and valerian all have sedating properties and appear in contexts suggesting psychiatric use. The doses and specific applications remain unclear, but the recognition that certain plants affected mental state and could modify disturbed behavior shows remarkable observation. But the most intriguing aspect is social management of mental illness. Some sources describe families caring for mentally ill members for years, suggesting tolerance for conditions that didn't threaten community safety. Other accounts mention temporary exile during acute episodes, with return permitted once symptoms subsided. This implies understanding that some mental illnesses were episodic rather than permanent, a recognition that modern psychiatry didn't formalize until the 19th century. The Norse worldview incorporated spiritual explanations for mental illness, nice, possession by spirits, curses, or divine displeasure, but these explanations didn't preclude practical treatment. They could simultaneously believe madness came from supernatural sources, while treating it with herbs and environmental changes. This both-and thinking seems contradictory to modern either-or frameworks, but it allowed them to pursue practical solutions while maintaining cultural beliefs. Number, preventive medicine and public health. The Norse didn't just treat illness, they practiced prevention through cultural norms that modern public health recognizes as effective. The emphasis on bathing, unusual for medieval Europe. Icelandic law required farms to have privies located away from water sources, preventing fecal contamination of drinking water. Communities maintained public bathing houses where people gathered weekly, combining social activity with hygiene in ways that incidentally reduced disease spread. Food preservation techniques prevented foodborne illness through methods we now understand killed pathogens or prevented their growth. Smoking fish and meat created surface compounds toxic to bacteria. Fermenting foods produced acids that inhibited dangerous organisms while preserving nutritional value. Drying reduced water content below levels, supporting bacterial growth. The Norse didn't understand microbiology, but they'd learned through observation which preservation methods prevented illness and which led to poisoning. Quarantine practices appear in some sources, though we don't know how consistently enforced. Ships arriving from regions experiencing epidemics were sometimes required to anchor offshore before crew could land. Travelers showing signs of illness were occasionally denied entry to communities. These practices suggest recognition of contagion, understanding that illness could spread from person to person without knowledge of disease mechanisms. The recognition was sufficient to motivate preventive behavior, that modern epidemiology confirms as effective. Number, the limits of knowledge. Despite their sophistication, Norse medicine had hard limits. They couldn't treat bacterial infections systemically. Once sepsis developed, death usually followed. They couldn't perform internal surgery safely. Opening the abdomen or chest cavity almost invariably caused fatal infection. They had the treatment for most epidemic diseases. When plague reached Scandinavia, it killed with the same efficiency as elsewhere in Europe. They couldn't save patients with massive trauma or blood loss. The healers knew these limits. The sagas describe cases where medical practitioners declared wounds mortal and withdrew, focusing remaining efforts on easing death rather than attempting futile intervention. The knowledge was also unevenly distributed. Major settlements might have skilled healers with extensive training, while isolated farms relied on household knowledge passed from parent to child. The Volvur, specialist healers, were apparently trained through long apprenticeships, but we don't know how many existed or how widely available their services were. Most medical care was probably provided by family members using common remedies, with specialist intervention only for unusual cases or when family remedies failed. Some medical knowledge was secret or restricted. Several sources mention healers who refused to share their knowledge, taking it to their graves. Others describe knowledge passed only within families, creating hereditary healing lineages. This secrecy protected economic value. A healer with unique knowledge could charge premium prices, but it also made the knowledge vulnerable. If the healer died without apprentice, or if family lines ended, the knowledge vanished. How much Norse medical knowledge was lost this way remains unknowable, but likely substantial given the many gaps in the fragmentary records that survive. Number. What remains modern medicine owes less to Norse traditions than to Greek, Roman, and Islamic sources that were documented in writing and transmitted through institutional structures. But the Norse medical practices reveal something important. Sophisticated empirical knowledge can develop without literacy, formal science, or institutional support. They solved practical problems through observation and experimentation, accumulated successful solutions, and transmitted knowledge orally with sufficient fidelity to maintain effectiveness across generations. Some Norse remedies entered modern pharmacology after scientific analysis confirmed their effectiveness. Others remain folk medicine of uncertain value. Still others are lost completely, known only through fragmentary mentions in sagas that don't preserve enough detail for reconstruction. The knowledge system that supported Norse medicine, the training of healers, the accumulation of plant lore, the surgical techniques, vanished as literacy spread and written medical texts displaced oral traditions. What we've recovered through archaeology and textual analysis provides glimpses of a sophisticated medical system adapted to harsh conditions where professional help was often unavailable and survival required practical knowledge of human body and available remedies. But deeper questions remain about how they trained healers, how they standardized treatments across regions, how they incorporated new knowledge, and how they maintained knowledge quality over centuries without written records to preserve details. The Norse survived and sometimes thrived in conditions that killed their contemporaries. Their medical knowledge contributed to that survival, but the complete picture of what they knew and how they knew it remains partially hidden, accessible to us only through fragments that hint at sophistication we're only beginning to appreciate. In the year 986, an Icelandic farmer named Eirik Thorvaldsson, I.O. known as Eric the Red, sailed west from Iceland, with 25 ships carrying approximately 500 colonists, livestock, tools, and supplies to establish settlements in Greenland. 14 ships completed the journey. The colonists were travelling to a land where no trees grew, where the growing season lasted 8 weeks at most, where winter temperatures reached -40°C, and where supply ships from Iceland might arrive once per year or not at all. They were establishing an economy in conditions that seemed to guarantee failure. Yet the Greenland colonies persisted for over 400 years, supporting populations that peaked around 5,000 people, enough to sustain multiple settlements, churches, trade relationships, and cultural traditions. How did they survive? The answer reveals an economic system radically different from what we think of as economy today. They operated without money for most of their history, without markets in the modern sense, without specialization beyond a handful of critical crafts, and without the surplus production that defines economic success in contemporary thinking. They created what anthropologists call a subsistence plus economy, producing barely enough to survive while maintaining just enough surplus for trade, social obligations, and emergency reserves. This wasn't poverty but optimization for different goals, resilience rather than growth, sustainability rather than efficiency, social cohesion rather than individual wealth accumulation. The archaeological evidence from Greenland Norse sites tells a story of people operating at the edge of viability, making choices we can document but don't fully understand. Why did they invest enormous labor in raising cattle, animals poorly suited to Arctic conditions, when seal hunting provided more calories per hour of effort? Why did they maintain European-style clothing requiring complex textile production when fur garments were warmer and easier to make? Why did they continue building with scarce timber and turf when snow and ice blocks would have been more available? The answers lie not in pure survival optimization, but in cultural values, social structures, and economic logic that made sense in their context, even when it seems irrational to modern analysis. Number. The value of what cannot be measured. Norse economy operated largely without coined money. Instead, they used a complex system of value measurement where goods were assessed in units of value, wadmal, the most common being wadmal, a specific grade of woolen cloth. In Iceland, law codes specified prices and fines in ells of wadmal. A cow equaled 6 ells, a bull 8 ells, a riding horse 12 ells. But this wasn't barter in the simple sense of directly exchanging goods. Wadmal served as unit of account, a way to measure relative value without necessarily being the medium of exchange. A farmer might owe another farmer 6 ells of wadmal, but pay with cheese, fish, or labor instead, with everyone understanding the exchange rate. This system required shared understanding of value relationships, maintained across the community. Everyone needed to know what a cow was worth relative to a horse, what a day's labor equaled in cloth, what rent on land should be measured as. These valuations weren't set by supply and demand in a market, but established through tradition, law, and community consensus. The Gragas, Iceland's medieval law code, had specified standard values for hundreds of items, creating a reference framework everyone understood. But how did this system adapt to changing conditions? If a bad harvest made grain scarce, did grain become more valuable relative to other goods? If a disease killed many sheep, did wool prices rise? The law codes don't address this clearly, suggesting either that such fluctuations were managed through informal negotiation or that the system was rigid enough that short-term scarcity didn't affect base valuations. Archaeological evidence shows some goods did vary in availability across time, but we don't know whether this affected exchange rates or if people simply made do with less of scarce items while maintaining traditional values. The absence of market prices meant economic transactions required extensive negotiation and relied heavily on social relationships. You couldn't simply pay and walk away. Every transaction occurred in a web of ongoing relationships where reputation mattered enormously. Cheating someone today meant they'd refuse to deal with you tomorrow, and word would spread through the community. This social enforcement mechanism kept the system honest, but also made it personal and potentially vulnerable to feuds and grudges that could disrupt economic function. Number. The tyranny of distance. Greenland's economy faced challenges that Iceland's didn't. extreme isolation, and nearly complete lack of locally available timber, iron, and grain. Every ship timber, every tool, every gram of metal had to be imported from Iceland or beyond, a journey of approximately 1,000 kilometers across some of the North Atlantic's most dangerous waters. Ships might arrive annually in good years, once every few years in bad years, or not at all if voyages failed. This created an economy where certain goods were essentially irreplaceable. Once an iron axe broke, it might be years before replacement was possible. The response was a culture of maintenance and repair elevated to art form. Archaeological sites show iron tools worn down to tiny stubs through repeated resharpening, axes reduced to barely functional fragments, knives ground down until almost nothing remained. They couldn't afford to discard tools that modern people would consider worn out. Broken tools were repaired by forge welding pieces together, a difficult technique requiring scarce fuel and specialist skill. Metal was so valuable that even tiny fragments were saved. Excavations find minuscule pieces of iron carefully stored, presumably awaiting accumulation of enough scrap to forge something new. Wood underwent similar extreme preservation. Driftwood, carried by currents from Siberia, provided the only local timber source. Coastal residents claimed driftwood rights on their beaches, and law codes specified procedures for driftwood collection and ownership. The wood was used sparingly, a few planks for critical structural Ephraim beaming space, elements, small pieces for tool handles, chips for kindling. Buildings used stone and turf to the maximum extent possible, incorporating wood only where absolutely necessary. Even then, wood from collapsed buildings was salvaged and reused, with some timbers showing evidence of use in multiple structures over centuries. The economic implications of this scarcity were profound. In Norway or Iceland, building a house required significant labor but relatively modest material costs. Timber was available, if you had land with trees. In Greenland, the same house required not just labor but imported materials that might take years to acquire. This made building projects multi-year endeavors, requiring advanced planning and careful accumulation of materials. It also made buildings enormously valuable. A farm with substantial timber-framed structures represented decades of imported materials and construction effort. Abandoning such infrastructure wasn't done lightly. Number, the social insurance system. Norse society developed what modern economists would recognize as insurance mechanisms, AD, ways to spread risk across the community so that individual misfortune didn't cause complete failure. These mechanisms weren't formalized policies but cultural practices embedded in social obligations and expectations. The systems operated through reciprocity. Helping others created obligations they'd repay by helping you when you needed it. The most visible mechanism was the feast system. Wealthy households were expected to host feasts periodically, where community members gathered to eat, drink, and socialize. These weren't purely social events but redistribution mechanisms. Chi. The wealthy converted surplus production into social capital by feeding others. The feasts also created obligations, attendees, who benefited were expected to support the host in disputes, provide labor when needed, or reciprocate with their own hospitality. A farmer who hosted generous feasts could call on many people for help. One who hoarded resources found few allies. The system worked as insurance because wealth was unstable. Anyone could face disaster. A harsh winter might kill your livestock. A fire might destroy your stores. An injury might prevent you from working. If you'd been generous during good times, the community supported you through bad times. If you'd been stingy, you faced disaster alone. This created powerful incentives for generosity, even from pure self-interest, independent of any moral arguments about obligation to help others. But the system had limits. If disaster struck too many households simultaneously, a widespread famine, an epidemic, a volcanic eruption affecting whole regions, a 1909 The support network could collapse because nobody had surplus to share. The sagas describe such periods where normal reciprocity broke down, and people hoarded what they had rather than sharing. The system was robust against individual misfortune but vulnerable to correlated shocks affecting everyone simultaneously. Another insurance mechanism was fosterage, HEA, sending children to be raised by other families. This practice served multiple purposes: building alliances between families, providing education and training, and distributing consumption burden across households. A family with many children and limited resources could send some to wealthier relatives, reducing strain on their own household while creating relationships that benefited everyone. The fostered children often received inheritance rights from their foster families while maintaining ties to birth families, creating networks of obligation spanning multiple households. Number, specialization, and its limits. Most Norse people were generalists by necessity, ISE, farmers who also fished, hunted, built their own structures, made their own clothes, and repaired their own tools. Specialization was limited to a few crafts, requiring skills beyond what most people could develop through casual practice. Blacksmithing was the most critical specialization highline required, expertise, tools and materials that most farms couldn't support. Every community needed access to a smith, either a resident specialist or periodic visits from traveling craftsmen. Shipbuilding represented another specialized craft, though with different economic structure than smithing. Building a ship required resources beyond what most individuals could provide: timber from many trees, iron for thousands of rivets, wool for massive sails, and months of skilled labor. Ships were often built through collective investment, where multiple people contributed resources and then shared ownership. The ship might be sailed on trading voyages with profits distributed among the owners, or used for fishing with catches divided. This cooperative ownership structure spread both investment costs and returns across multiple households. Weaving represented a specialized skill that remained household-based, rather than becoming professional craft. Every farm produced textiles, flock, clothing, blankets, sails, but quality varied enormously. High-quality vadmal required expertise in wool selection, spinning consistency, weaving tension, and finishing treatments. The best weavers' products commanded premium prices, but even they weren't full-time specialists. They were farmers who also happened to be exceptional weavers, not professional textile workers. This pattern, household-level skill variation, rather than dedicated specialization, tuslation, characterized most Norse crafts. The limited specialization had economic consequences. It meant lower productivity than full-time specialists would achieve. A farmer who only smiths occasionally never reaches the skill level or efficiency of a dedicated blacksmith. But it provided resilience. Every household retained basic competence in all necessary skills, reducing dependence on specialists who might be unavailable. The trade-off between efficiency and resilience wasn't consciously calculated, but emerged from conditions where vulnerability to disruption exceeded the benefits of efficiency gains through specialization. Number trade and the limits of self-sufficiency. No, Norse settlement was fully self-sufficient. All relied on trade for critical goods. Even timber-rich Norway traded for iron, silver, and luxury goods. Iceland traded fish and wadmal for timber, grain, and iron. Greenland traded walrus ivory and hides for everything: timber, iron, grain, tools, cloth. The trade networks weren't optional luxuries but essential systems that settlements needed to survive. But trade was uncertain and expensive. Ships were lost to storms regularly. Perhaps 10 to 20% of voyages never arrived. This risk meant goods had to be valuable enough to justify the risk and cost of transportation. Bulk goods like timber barely made economic sense. A ship could carry limited cargo, and losing a timber shipment meant loss of the ship's value, plus cargo, plus crew. Only high-value goods justified the risk. Walrus ivory worth its weight in silver. Fine cloth that packed densely. Iron tools with enormous value in resource-scarce environments. The economic structure of trade voyages reveals the risk calculus. Crews were often compensated with shares of profits rather than wages. They invested their labor and risked their lives in exchange for percentage of successful voyages' returns. Ship owners provided the vessel but took only a share of profits rather than the entire return. This distributed risk and return among all participants, aligning incentives and ensuring everyone was motivated to make the voyage successful. It also meant unsuccessful voyages, those that returned empty or failed to return at all, left everyone worse off but didn't bankrupt any single party. Trade routes were maintained through combination of economic profit and social obligation. Wealthy Icelanders were expected to maintain trading ships partly for economic return, but also for prestige and community service. The ships provided necessary connections to broader world, bringing not just goods, but also news, visitors, and cultural contact. A community without trade connections was isolated, not just economically but socially and culturally. This made maintaining trade connections a community priority beyond pure economic calculation. Number. The collapse that shouldn't have surprised. The Greenland colonies disappeared sometime in the 15th century, sepsis. By the time explorers returned, the settlements were abandoned, with no survivors and few clues about what happened. The mystery of Greenland's collapse has generated theories, ranging from climate change to disease to conflict with indigenous peoples. But economic analysis suggests vulnerability was built into the system from the beginning. The colonies operated at the limit of viability, dependent on supply lines that were always marginal. Any disruption, APT, climate deterioration, reducing local food production, changes in European markets reducing demand for walrus ivory, increasing ice making navigation more difficult, could push the system past sustainability. Archaeological evidence shows the final generations lived increasingly desperate lives. Skeletal remains show nutritional stress. Tools became cruder as metal became unavailable. Buildings weren't repaired. The signs point to an economy gradually failing as trade connections weakened and local resources became insufficient to maintain the population. Some residents probably left voluntarily when conditions deteriorated enough. Others might have died from starvation or disease. The specific mechanism of final abandonment remains uncertain, but the underlying cause seems clear. An economy that worked only under narrow conditions failed when those conditions changed. But deeper questions remain. Why didn't they adapt more rapidly? The Thule people, ancestors of modern Inuit, thrived in Greenland using different subsistence. Strategies focused on sea mammals and seasonal migration. The Norse maintained their European-style farming culture despite its poor fit to the environment. This cultural conservatism has puzzled researchers. Why not adopt techniques that worked better? The answer likely involves cultural identity more than pure survival optimization. The Norse weren't just surviving, they were maintaining their identity as Norse. Abandoning farming for hunting, adopting Thule clothing and housing, learning Thule language and customs would have meant becoming something other than Norse. They chose cultural continuity over adaptation, and eventually that choice proved fatal. Number. What the economy reveals. The Norse economic system reveals a fundamental truth about human societies. Economics isn't just about efficiency or wealth maximization, but about maintaining communities under specific conditions and constraints. The Norse economy optimized for resilience and social cohesion in environments where these qualities mattered more than growth or accumulation. Their solutions, distributed ownership, reciprocal obligations, limited specialization, personal rather than market relationships, they made sense given their circumstances, even if they seem inefficient by modern standards. But the system also reveals vulnerability. Economies optimized for stable conditions can fail catastrophically when conditions change beyond adaptation capacity. The Greenland colonies showed this most dramatically, but even more successful settlements like Iceland faced periodic crises when climate, trade, or social conditions shifted. The resilience mechanisms that protected against individual or small-scale disruptions couldn't handle large-scale, sustained changes that exceeded the system's absorption capacity. Modern economies face similar trade-offs between efficiency and resilience, growth and sustainability, individual optimization, and social cohesion. We've generally chosen efficiency, growth, and individual optimization, achieving enormous material prosperity but potentially creating vulnerabilities the Norse would recognize. Global supply chains provide cheap goods but create dependencies where disruptions cascade across continents. Specialization increases productivity but eliminates the generalist skills that provide backup when specialists are unavailable. Market relationships enable efficient transactions but lack the social bonds that sustained Norse communities through hardship. The Norse economy was neither primitive nor irrational but adapted to its circumstances and values. Understanding how it worked and why it eventually failed provides perspective on our own economic choices and the trade-offs we're making, often unconsciously, as we build systems that shape how we live and whether we survive the challenges ahead. On the winter solstice, at 65 degrees north latitude, the sun rises at 11:47 in the morning and sets at 3:13 in the afternoon, 3 hours and 26 minutes of twilight that barely qualifies as daylight. For the surrounding months, darkness dominates. People wake in darkness, work in twilight or lamplight, and return to darkness. This isn't occasional hardship, but the fundamental condition of existence for nearly half the year. The Norse didn't just endure this darkness, they built civilizations within it, created art and literature during it, raised children who knew winter darkness as normal rather than exceptional. Modern humans living at similar latitudes report high rates of seasonal affective disorder, depression, and social dysfunction during dark months. We treat the darkness as pathology, requiring intervention, light therapy, vitamin D supplementation, pharmaceutical treatment. The Norse had none of these options. They faced the same darkness with only fire for light, no understanding of vitamin D deficiency or circadian rhythms, and no cultural framework suggesting that feeling terrible during winter was a medical condition. Yet they survived, and apparently maintained functional societies throughout the dark months. How? The answer isn't that they were somehow immune to darkness's psychological effects. Skeletal evidence shows they suffered vitamin D deficiency and related problems. Rather, they developed cultural and practical adaptations that minimized darkness's impact and created meaning within constraints they couldn't change. These adaptations weren't written as survival guides but embedded in social practices, architectural choices, and cultural attitudes we can only partially reconstruct from fragmentary evidence. What we can document suggests sophistication in managing not just physical survival but psychological survival, with maintaining morale, social cohesion, and mental health through conditions that would break communities lacking appropriate cultural frameworks. Number. The architecture of light. Norse buildings, especially in Iceland and Greenland, were designed around scarce light with attention to detail that reveals deep understanding of how light affected livability. The buildings positioned windows, expensive features requiring precious materials, on south-facing walls where they'd capture maximum winter sunday. Even tiny amounts of direct sunlight mattered psychologically, and architecture reflected this priority. Room layouts arranged spaces by light requirement, work areas needing visibility near windows, storage in darker zones, sleeping areas where darkness was acceptable. But the sophistication extended beyond window placement. The interior surfaces were often whitewashed, using lime or crushed shells mixed with water, creating reflective surfaces that amplified whatever light was available. This wasn't purely aesthetic choice, but functional decision, increasing effective light from fires and small windows. Modern photometric analysis of reconstructed Norse interiors shows that whitewashed surfaces could increase usable light by 30 to 40% compared to bare wood or stone, the difference between being able to work indoors and being limited to outdoor activities during brief daylight hours. The hearth placement reflects similar attention to light function beyond just heating. Central hearths radiated light in all directions, and the smoke before venting through roof holes dispersed throughout the room, creating diffuse illumination from fire glow scattered by smoke particles. This sounds unpleasant by modern standards, sitting in smoky interiors, but archaeological evidence shows hearths were designed to minimize smoke at seated height while using it for lighting above. The Norse accepted some discomfort for practical benefit of better illumination, yet questions remain about artificial lighting beyond hearth fires. Oil lamps using fish oil or seal oil appear in archaeological contexts, but we don't know how commonly they were used or whether they provided significant light or just symbolic illumination. Fish oil burns poorly, it's smoky, smells terrible, and provides weak light, but in total darkness, even weak light has value. Did households use oil lamps routinely, or only for special occasions? Did the smell become tolerable through familiarity, or did people avoid artificial lighting when possible? The artifacts prove the technology existed. The frequency and patterns of use remain uncertain. Number. The social structure of darkness. Winter transformed Norse social life from distributed outdoor activity to concentrated indoor activity. Families that worked separately during summer, herding sheep in different pastures, fishing from scattered locations, working distant fields, converged into single buildings for winter. This concentration created challenges and opportunities. The challenges included interpersonal conflict from forced proximity, disease transmission in crowded conditions, and cabin fever from months without privacy. The opportunities included concentrated time for teaching skills, telling stories, planning next year's activities, and maintaining social bonds. The archaeological evidence suggests they managed winter confinement through structured time use. Many artifacts are small items suitable for indoor craft work: bone needles, spindle whorls, weaving tools, wood carving implements. Winter was season for creating the goods that summer would use: spinning wool into thread, weaving thread into cloth, carving wooden implements, repairing tools and equipment. This wasn't make work, but essential production that could only happen when weather prevented outdoor labor. The work provided purpose and prevented the psychological deterioration that idleness can cause. But work alone doesn't explain how they maintain morale. The sagas provide glimpses of winter social life, storytelling that could last for hours, games including complex board games like Hnefata that required strategic thinking, music, and singing, and communal work, where multiple people collaborated on projects while socializing. These activities weren't recorded as survival techniques, but as entertainment, NET. Yet they served survival function by maintaining mental health and social cohesion through the psychological stress of confinement and darkness. The winter gathering practices also served educational purpose. Children learned skills by watching and assisting adults who had time to teach during winter. Stories transmitted cultural knowledge and values. Games taught strategic thinking and competition management. Music and poetry preserved language and cultural identity. Winter darkness, while physically challenging, created conditions for cultural transmission that summer's dispersed activity patterns couldn't support. This made winter crucial for maintaining the knowledge systems that enabled survival. The season of physical vulnerability was also the season of knowledge preservation. Number. The body's winter adaptation, modern. Research on human adaptation to high latitudes reveals biological changes the Norse would have experienced without understanding the mechanisms. Vitamin D deficiency from lack of sunlight affects calcium absorption, immune function, and mood regulation. Circadian rhythm disruption from light-dark cycle changes affects sleep quality, hormone production, and mental state. Seasonal variation in activity levels affects cardiovascular fitness and metabolism. The Norse faced all these challenges without modern nutritional knowledge or medical interventions, but they developed empirical solutions to some problems. The diet emphasized foods we now know contain vitamin D, fish, seal meat, cod liver, and other animal products that provide the nutrient independent of sun exposure. They didn't know they needed vitamin D, but they'd observed that certain foods were particularly important during winter, possibly because people felt better when eating them, or because communities that emphasized these foods had better health outcomes. The mechanism remained hidden, but the effective solution was discovered and maintained through cultural transmission. Sleep patterns probably adapted to seasonal light variations in ways modern industrial society prevents. Recent research on human sleep in natural light conditions shows people naturally sleep longer in winter and shorter in summer when not constrained by artificial schedules. The Norse likely followed similar patterns, sleeping more during dark winter months, working longer during bright summer nights. This natural adaptation to seasonal variation contrasts with modern expectation of consistent schedules year-round, which creates chronic circadian disruption at high latitudes. Physical activity patterns also adapted seasonally. Summer brought intensive outdoor work, farming, construction, travel, fishing, AET, that maintained high fitness levels. Winter reduced activity levels, but the indoor work of craft production, the necessary outdoor work of animal care, and the effort of surviving cold conditions prevented complete inactivity. Modern concerns about sedentary winter lifestyles assume comfort and easy survival. For the Norse, merely staying warm and fed required constant effort that maintained baseline activity levels. Number, the psychology of endurance. Perhaps the deepest mystery is how Norse communities maintained psychological resilience through repeated cycles of hardship. Every autumn brought certainty of months of darkness, cold, and confinement. Every spring required rebuilding effort, repairing damage, and resuming outdoor activity. The cycle repeated endlessly with no prospect of escape. You couldn't move to somewhere with better weather, because everywhere at those latitudes faced similar conditions. Modern psychology recognizes that hopelessness, upon believing conditions won't improve, is more damaging than hardship itself. How did the Norse avoid hopelessness when conditions genuinely wouldn't improve? Part of the answer lies in seasonal rather than permanent framework. Winter was terrible, but it ended. Summer brought relief, opportunity, and relatively pleasant conditions. The cycle's predictability meant people could endure winter by anticipating summer, rather than needing to believe winter itself would improve. This differs from modern poverty or chronic illness, where no relief is certain. The Norse could count on seasonal improvement, even if annual conditions remained harsh. Cultural attitudes towards suffering probably also mattered. Norse literature emphasizes endurance as virtue and complaining as weakness. The sagas praise characters who face hardships stoically and mock those who whine or give up. This wasn't just literary convention, but reflection of values necessary for psychological survival in harsh conditions. If culture defines suffering as temporary test of character rather than injustice requiring complaint, people experience the same conditions differently. Whether this made them actually feel better or just prevented them from expressing suffering remains uncertain. We can document the cultural values, but not the subjective experience of individuals living under them. The social nature of hardship mattered as well. Everyone faced the same darkness, the same cold, the same confinement. Suffering was shared rather than isolated, which modern psychology recognizes as protective factor. Complaining about conditions everyone experienced equally would seem pointless. What's the alternative? Acceptance becomes easier when hardship is universal and inevitable rather than random or unfair. This isn't optimism but realism, adapted to unchangeable circumstances. Number, what we've lost and what remains. The complete system of Norse winter survival, ESM, the integration of architectural design, social practices, dietary choices, work patterns, cultural attitudes, and psychological frameworks have largely vanished. Modern Scandinavians live in heated buildings with electric lighting, supplement vitamin D, and maintain year-round schedules regardless of season. The old ways became unnecessary when technology provided alternatives, and skills unnecessary for survival disappear within generations. But something valuable was lost alongside the hardship. The Norse developed deep understanding of living within natural constraints rather than overcoming them through technology. They created cultural practices that maintained human well-being under challenging conditions using only what the environment provided. They understood seasonal rhythms and adapted to them, rather than fighting to maintain artificial consistency. These capabilities are rare now. Modern humans expect constant comfort and falter when technology fails or circumstances force survival with limited resources. The winter survival skills also represented knowledge about human psychological and social resilience that we've only recently begun to scientifically study. The Norse didn't have psychology as a discipline, but they'd learned through generations of experience what practices maintained mental health and social cohesion under stress. They knew how to structure time to provide purpose, how to maintain social bonds under forced proximity, how to find meaning in hardship, and how to endure suffering without losing hope. This knowledge existed as cultural practice rather than explicit theory, transmitted through participation rather than instruction. Recent research on extreme environment psychology, ATS studying Antarctic stations, submarines, and similar contexts, ATS, rediscovers principles the Norse knew empirically. Small isolated groups need structured routines, purposeful activity, social rituals, and psychological space to maintain function over months. Modern researchers frame these as discoveries. The Norse simply did what worked without analyzing why. But the knowledge content is similar, understanding what humans need to maintain well-being under conditions that challenge basic needs and psychological comfort. Number. The ultimate winter lesson. What winter taught the Norse, not winter taught the Norse, and what their example teaches us, is that human resilience has greater depth than comfortable modern life reveals. We've created societies that minimize hardship and maximize comfort, which is wonderful but comes at cost of testing and developing resilience capacities. The Norse had no choice but to develop those capacities, and they proved humans can maintain functioning societies and even flourish culturally under conditions modern people consider intolerable. This doesn't romanticize hardship or suggest we should abandon comfort. The Norse would have eagerly accepted modern heating, lighting, and nutrition if available. But their experience proves that when circumstances deny comfort, humans possess adaptive capacities we don't discover until challenged. In an era facing potential resource scarcity, climate disruption, and infrastructure vulnerability, understanding that humans have successfully adapted to harsh conditions before provides evidence that adaptation is possible, not easy or pleasant, but achievable through appropriate knowledge, cultural frameworks, and collective effort. The Norse survival skills were specific to their time and place, but the underlying principles, careful observation, cultural transmission of knowledge, social cooperation, psychological resilience, and adaptation to unchangeable constraints, ACB, remain relevant regardless of specific challenges faced. What winter taught them was that survival requires not just physical resources, but social structures, mental frameworks, and cultural practices that maintain human function when conditions challenge our biology and psychology. These lessons, encoded in archaeological remains and fragmentary texts, speak across centuries about human capacity to survive, adapt, and find meaning even when comfort seems impossible and hope requires effort.